The red and blue lights were already flashing through the trees when I heard the knock on my cabin door. Not a normal knock. Sharp. Repeated. Like someone trying to prove a point. Gravel crunched under heavy boots outside, slow and deliberate. I hadn't even parked my truck yet. The engine was still ticking from the drive up the mountain. I stepped out and the cold air hit my face, pine and damp wood mixing with something metallic in the air. That's when I saw her. Brenda Whitmore. Standing beside a sheriff's deputy like she owned the place. Arms folded. Chin slightly raised. Holding up a small brass key between her fingers like evidence. Something about that key didn't sit right. The deputy looked at me, then at her, unsure who was supposed to be in charge here. "Sir," he said, calm but firm, "we got a call about unauthorized access to this property." Unauthorized. The word hung there. I stared at my own front door. My cabin. The wood still had the same scratch near the handle from when I installed it last summer. I knew every inch of it. Brenda stepped forward before I could answer. Her perfume cut through the forest air, too sharp for a place like this. "He doesn't have the proper HOA key," she said, tapping that brass piece against her palm. "This cabin is under community regulation now." Community. Up here. That was new. I reached into my pocket slowly and pulled out my keyring. The familiar weight grounded me. No rush. No reaction. The metal clicked softly as I found the right key. The deputy watched closely. Brenda didn't blink. I slid the key into the lock. It turned clean. One smooth motion. The door opened. No hesitation. No resistance. Just a quiet click that said everything. The deputy exhaled. Not loud. Just enough. Brenda's smile didn't move. That was the problem. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she looked patient. Like this was just step one. Something colder settled in my chest. The kind that doesn't come from weather. The deputy cleared his throat, mumbled something about a misunderstanding, and stepped back toward his cruiser. The radio crackled softly at his shoulder. Another call waiting somewhere else. Brenda stayed right where she was. Watching the door. Watching my hand still resting on the handle. "That key won't matter soon," she said quietly. No raised voice. No anger. Just certainty. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. But I noticed something then. The way she glanced at the lock. Not at me. Not at the deputy. At the lock. Like she already knew something about it I didn't. A light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint hum of distant power lines. Everything else went still. Too still. I stepped inside and closed the door slowly, the latch settling into place with a soft, final sound. And for the first time, that lock didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. Something about this wasn't over. The cabin felt different the moment the door shut behind me. The silence pressed in, thicker than usual, like the walls were holding something back. I set my keys down on the wooden table and stood still for a second. Listening. No footsteps outside. No voices. Just wind brushing through the trees and that faint electrical hum in the distance. But something was off. I walked back to the door and looked at the lock up close. Same hardware. Same screws. But there were fresh marks around the keyhole. Tiny. Almost clean. Like someone had tested it. I ran my thumb over the metal. Cold. Recently touched. That did not happen by accident. I stepped back and scanned the room. Everything looked normal. Tools where I left them. Coffee mug still half full from yesterday morning. But the air carried a faint scent that did not belong. Not pine. Not wood. Something artificial. Faint perfume. She had been closer than I thought. I moved to the window and angled the blinds just enough to see the driveway. Empty. The sheriff was gone. Her car too. But the gravel still showed fresh tire tracks. 2 sets. One arriving. One leaving slower than normal. Like someone had waited. I checked my phone. No signal as usual up here. No messages. No missed calls. Just silence. But then I noticed something else. A small reflection on the far edge of the porch. I narrowed my eyes. There. A tiny glint of metal near the railing. Too small to be random. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. Slowly, boots crunching against the gravel. The air felt colder now. Sharper. I walked toward the porch corner and crouched down. It was a pin-sized piece of metal. Embedded just enough to stay in place. Not part of the structure. Not part of anything I built. I touched it lightly. It did not move. That was intentional. I straightened up and looked back at the door. Then at the lock. Then at the tree lean. Something connected here. Something quiet. Something planned. She did not call the sheriff because of a key. She wanted a reason to be here. Close enough to study the door. Close enough to touch the lock. Close enough to leave something behind. I stepped back inside and shut the door again, slower this time. The latch clicked, but it did not feel final anymore. I picked up my keyring and weighed it in my hand. Same keys. Same cabin. But not the same situation. My eyes went back to the lock. Then to my tool bench in the corner. That old steel case I had not opened in months suddenly felt relevant again. I walked over and flipped it open. The smell of oil and metal hit instantly. Familiar. Grounding. Inside were parts. Sensors. Components I used for custom builds back in the city. Things most people would never think to use on a front door. I ran my fingers over them, slow and deliberate. If she wanted access, she was not going to ask again. And if she had already tested the lock once, she would test it again. I glanced back at the door one more time. This time, I noticed something I had missed before. The keyhole was not perfectly aligned anymore. Just slightly off. Almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. That was not wear and tear. That was interference. And it meant one thing. She already had a way in. I did not sleep that night. The cabin stayed dark, but my eyes stayed on the door. Every few minutes, the wood creaked as the temperature dropped, and each sound felt louder than it should. The lock sat there in the dim light, quiet, ordinary, but I knew better now. I sat at the table with my tools spread out in front of me, metal pieces lined up like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The smell of machine oil. Cut through the stale air. Familiar. Controlled. Unlike everything else happening here. I picked up the lock cylinder I had removed and turned it slowly in my hand. The alignment was off by less than a millimeter. Most people would never notice. But I did. And that meant someone had already been inside the mechanism. Not breaking it. Studying it. That was the part that bothered me. This was not random. This was patient. I set the cylinder down and reached for a smaller component from my kit. A sensor unit. Lightweight. Quiet. Designed to detect pressure changes. I had used it years ago for a custom project. Never thought I would need it here. But things change. I moved to the door and started working. Slow. Precise. Each screw came out clean. Each piece went back tighter than before. The metal clicked softly under my fingers. Every sound echoed just enough to remind me how isolated this place really was. Halfway through, I stopped. Something outside. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one. The wind had dropped. Completely. I held still and listened. Nothing moved. That silence felt wrong. I stepped back from the door and walked to the window again. The trees stood still. No sway. No rustle. Just a frozen line of shadows under the moonlight. Then I saw it. A faint reflection again. Same spot near the porch railing. But this time it flickered. Once. Then gone. I narrowed my eyes. That was not a random reflection. That was active. I turned off the cabin lights immediately. Darkness settled in fast. My reflection disappeared from the glass, and the outside became clearer. I waited. Counting slowly in my head. 1. 2. 3. Nothing. Then there it was again. A tiny blink. Like something responding. I stepped away from the window and back to the door. My hand rested on the new components I had just installed. Not finished yet. Not fully active. But enough to test. I adjusted one connection and heard a soft internal click. Different from before. Smarter. The system was waking up. I stepped back and watched the lock. No movement. No sound. But I could feel it now. The difference. This was no longer just a barrier. It was aware. I returned to the table and picked up the last piece. A small transmitter. The final part. I hesitated for a second. Once this went in, there was no going back to simple. I installed it anyway. The circuit completed with a faint hum, barely audible, but real. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own breath slow down. Outside, the silence shifted again. A faint crunch of gravel this time. Very soft. Very controlled. Not an animal. Too careful. My eyes locked on the door as the handle moved just a fraction, like someone testing it from the outside. The handle moved again. Slower this time. Testing. Feeling for resistance. I did not move. I stood in the dark, a few feet back, watching the shape of the door like it might breathe. The new lock stayed still, but inside it, I heard the faintest internal tick. The system was reading pressure. Measuring intent. That was the difference now. Before, it was just metal. Now, it was listening. The handle stopped. A pause. Then a soft metallic scrape. Not from my key. Too light. Too precise. I felt my jaw tighten. She was not guessing anymore. She knew exactly where to press. I took one slow step closer, careful not to let the floor creak. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see the outline of the keyhole. Then it happened. A small red pulse flickered inside the mechanism. Barely visible. The sensor triggered. Someone was applying controlled torque from the outside. Not forcing it. Working it. Like they had done this before. I stayed silent. Let it happen. That was the plan. The system needed data. The lock clicked once. Not open. Just feedback. A warning cycle. The handle jerked slightly in response. Whoever was outside felt it. I could almost picture her expression shifting. Not fear. Confusion. That made more sense. Brenda did not expect resistance. She expected compliance. Another pause. Longer this time. The night stretched around the cabin, thick and quiet. Then I heard it. A faint whisper of fabric brushing wood. She leaned closer to the door. Listening back. That detail told me everything. This was not about access anymore. This was about control. I reached behind me and picked up the small handheld receiver from the table. The screen lit up dimly, casting a soft glow across my fingers. Data started scrolling. Time stamps. Pressure points. Entry attempts. Every movement outside translated into numbers. Clean. Precise. Documented. The system was working. Better than I expected. The handle moved again, faster now. A slight twist, then another. The red pulse inside the lock flickered more frequently. The algorithm was adapting. Learning the pattern. Matching it. I could feel the rhythm changing. She was getting impatient. That was the mistake. The lock gave a sharper click this time. Louder. Intentional. A boundary. The handle stopped completely. Silence returned, but it was not empty anymore. It was loaded. I held my breath for a second. Waiting. Then footsteps. Light. Controlled. Moving off the porch. Gravel shifted softly under weight. Not running. Not rushing. Just leaving. Like nothing had happened. That was the most unsettling part. I moved to the window and looked out slowly. A shadow slipped between the trees, then disappeared. No car engine. No headlights. She had parked farther away this time. Planned it. I looked back at the receiver in my hand. The data log kept updating for a few seconds, then froze. Session complete. Attempt recorded. I stared at the screen. One line stood out. Access pattern recognized. That should not have been possible on the first try. Not unless the system had something to compare it to. I felt a slow chill run through my chest. I turned back to the door, eyes narrowing at the lock now sitting quietly in place. It had not just learned tonight. It had seen this pattern before. The screen in my hand did not go dark. It stayed lit, frozen on that last line like it wanted me to read it twice. Access pattern recognized. I did not move for a few seconds. Just stood there, letting that sink in. The cabin felt smaller suddenly. Like the walls had shifted in closer without making a sound. I looked back at the door. The lock sat quiet. Clean. No sign of what just happened. But I knew better now. I stepped closer and crouched down, bringing the receiver with me. I scrolled back through the log slowly. Time stamps lined up perfectly. Pressure curves. Entry angles. Every attempt mapped out in clean data points. Then I saw it. A previous match entry. Older. Buried deeper in the system memory. My thumb paused over the screen. That entry should not exist. I had just installed this system tonight. Fresh components. Fresh code. No prior data. That meant one thing. The system had not learned this pattern from tonight. It had inherited it. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I reached out and touched the lock again. Cold metal. Solid. But now it felt like I was touching something with a memory I did not give it. I stood up and walked back to the table. The tool case was still open. Parts scattered exactly where I left them. I picked up the original cylinder I had removed earlier and turned it under the dim light. The misalignment. The wear marks. The subtle grind along the inner edge. Someone had worked this before. Not just tonight. More than once. I set it down carefully. My eyes drifted toward the corner of the room. The place where I kept old hardware. Spare parts. Things I had not used in years. I moved over and pulled open the lower drawer. The wood scraped softly. Inside were older locks. Backup systems. Components from previous builds. I dug through them slowly. Metal against metal. Quiet clinks in the still air. Then I found it. An older sensor unit. Same model as the one I installed tonight. But this one was not clean. It had residue on the casing. Fine dust mixed with something darker. I turned it over in my hand. The ports showed signs of prior connection. Recently. Not years ago. Recently. That made no sense. I had not touched this drawer in months. I knew that for a fact. I closed the drawer halfway and stopped. Something did not add up. I stood there, thinking through it piece by piece. The keyhole misalignment. The embedded metal piece on the porch. The access pattern already in memory. The used sensor in a drawer I never opened. This was not just someone testing a lock. This was someone preparing the environment. Slowly. Quietly. Over time. I walked back to the window again and looked out into the darkness. The trees stood still, but now they felt like a barrier instead of a backdrop. Somewhere out there, she had been watching. Not just tonight. Before tonight. I turned back to the door one more time. The lock gave a faint internal click. Not triggered by touch. Not triggered by pressure. Just a soft mechanical shift on its own. I looked down at the receiver. A new line appeared on the screen. System sync complete. That was not something I programmed. My grip tightened around the device. The system was not just recording anymore. It was updating itself. And I had no idea what it just connected to. The words on the screen did not fade. System sync complete. I stared at it, waiting for it to correct itself, like maybe I had misread something in the dark. It did not change. The receiver stayed steady in my hand, faint warmth building from the battery. I had not coded any sync function. Not for this setup. Not for something this isolated. There was no network up here. No signal. Nothing to connect to. That was the whole point of this place. I looked back at the lock again. Still. Silent. But now it felt like it was ahead of me. I moved closer, slower this time, like approaching something that might react. The metal surface reflected a thin strip of moonlight from the window. Clean. Untouched. But I knew it had just done something on its own. That meant there was another layer. Something hidden in the hardware or deeper in the system. I turned and went straight to the tool bench. My hands moved faster now, not rushed, but focused. I grabbed a small diagnostic reader and connected it to the secondary port inside the lock housing. The connection clicked softly. For a second, nothing happened. Then the reader lit up. Lines of data began to scroll. Not mine. Not my formatting. Different structure. Different logic. I leaned closer, eyes narrowing. The code was layered. My system sat on top, clean and simple. Underneath it, something else ran deeper. Older. Embedded. I scrolled slowly. Timestamp logs extended far beyond tonight. Weeks. Maybe months. That was impossible. I had not installed anything here before tonight. I disconnected the reader and stepped back. My breath slowed. I forced it steady. Think. Not react. That was how you stayed ahead. I walked back to the table and picked up the old sensor unit again. The residue on it caught the dim light. I brought it closer to my face. Fine particles. Not just dust. Wood fibers. Same tone as the porch railing. That meant it had been outside. Recently. Not stored. Used. I turned it over again and saw a small scratch near the connector port. Fresh. Sharp edge. Not worn down yet. Someone had handled this recently. Someone had access to my tools. I set it down slowly and looked around the cabin. Every surface. Every corner. Nothing looked disturbed. But now that did not mean anything. Whoever did this did not leave obvious signs. They moved through here like they belonged. Like they had time. That thought settled heavy. I walked back to the door again and crouched lower this time, bringing my eyes level with the lock. I adjusted the panel slightly and exposed more of the internal assembly. The new components I added sat clean against the frame. But behind them, deeper inside, I saw it. A thin wire. Not mine. Routed along the inner edge. Hidden behind the original housing. I reached in carefully and traced it with my fingertip. It led upward. Into the wall. My chest tightened just enough to notice. That wire had been there before I touched anything tonight. Which meant the system was never just mine. I followed the wire with my eyes as far as I could see. It disappeared behind the wooden frame. Clean entry. No splinters. No forced cuts. Installed with precision. I stood up slowly and stepped back. The cabin felt different again. Not smaller this time. Controlled. Like I had walked into something already set in motion. The receiver in my hand vibrated lightly. A new notification. I looked down. One line. External access route confirmed. I did not move for a second. Then I looked back at the wall where the wire disappeared. If there was an access route, it meant one thing. There was another way in I had never seen. I did not touch the wire right away. I just stood there, staring at it, letting my eyes adjust to what I was actually seeing. A hidden line, cleanly installed, running through my wall like it had always belonged there. That meant time. Planning. Access I never granted. I stepped back slowly and scanned the rest of the door frame. If there was one line, there could be more. My fingers brushed along the wood, feeling for any irregular edge. Nothing obvious. That was the point. Whoever did this did not rush. They built it into the structure. I turned and grabbed a small flashlight from the bench, shielding the beam with my hand as I angled it low across the wall. The light revealed subtle lines in the grain. Faint. Almost invisible. But there. Running upward. I followed it carefully, inch by inch. It led past the frame and into the side paneling near the corner. I tapped lightly. Solid. No hollow echo. That did not make sense. I tapped again, slightly higher. Same result. Whoever routed this did not cut corners. They reinforced it. I stepped back and looked around the cabin again, this time not as an owner, but as someone searching for access points. Windows. Vents. Floor seams. Every possible entry. Everything I had trusted suddenly felt like part of a system I did not design. I moved toward the far wall where the old heating vent sat. I had not used it in years. The metal grate was dusty, untouched at first glance. But when I crouched down, I noticed something subtle. The screws were newer. Slightly shinier than the rest. Recently turned. I ran my finger along the edge. Clean. Too clean. I unscrewed it slowly. Each turn echoed louder than it should. The grate came loose with a soft pull. Cold air drifted out, carrying that same faint artificial scent. I angled the flashlight inside. At first, just ductwork. Standard. Then deeper, something else. A small junction box mounted along the side. Not part of any heating system I had ever installed. I leaned closer. Wires ran from it. Thin. Precise. Matching the one inside my door. My chest tightened again, slower this time. This was not a single access route. This was a network. I pulled back and sat on the floor for a second, letting the weight of that settle. Every movement tonight. Every test at the door. It was all connected to something already built around me. I had been reacting inside a system that was already active. That realization shifted everything. I stood up and walked back. Toward the door again, more controlled now. If this was a system, it had rules. Patterns. Logic. And systems always left traces. I picked up the receiver again and checked the latest data. The interface had changed slightly. Subtle, but different. New icons. New pathways. I navigated carefully, scrolling deeper into the logs. Then I saw it. A map layout. Not detailed, but structured. Nodes. Lines. Connections. My cabin was just one point. One node. My grip tightened around the device. I zoomed in slightly. Another node blinked faintly nearby. Then another. This was bigger than one cabin. Bigger than one lock. I looked up slowly, eyes drifting toward the window and the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, the rest of this system was still running. I kept staring at the map on the receiver like it might change if I blinked. It did not. The nodes stayed where they were. Fixed. Quiet. Connected. My cabin was just one point in a larger grid. That part was clear now. What was not clear was who built it. Or why. I zoomed in again, slower this time. The interface responded instantly, smoother than anything I had written. Each node pulsed faintly, like it was alive in its own way. I counted at least 6 within range. Maybe more beyond the edge of the screen. That meant other cabins. Other properties. Other people. Or maybe just empty structures wired into the same system. That thought sat heavy. I looked up toward the ceiling instinctively. Then the walls. Then the floor. Every surface suddenly felt like it could be hiding something. I forced myself to stay focused. Panic would not help. Patterns would. Systems always followed rules. I tapped on the nearest node besides mine. The screen shifted. Data loaded instantly. Access logs. Pressure readings. Entry attempts. Not mine. Different timestamps. Different behavior. But the structure was identical. Same type of lock. Same monitoring pattern. My jaw tightened. This was not random installation. This was uniform. Planned. Replicated. I scrolled further. A label appeared near the top of the screen. Unit 4B. That stopped me for a second. Unit. Not cabin. Not property. Unit. Like this place was part of something organized. Something managed. I leaned back slightly, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The cabin did not feel like mine anymore. It felt assigned. I shifted my attention back to the map. One node pulsed brighter than the others. Slightly off to the west. Not far. Maybe half a mile through the trees. I tapped it. The screen lagged for a fraction of a second. Then loaded. Live activity. My breath slowed. Pressure data updated in real time. Small fluctuations. Not constant. Like someone was near the lock. Testing it. Or using it. I watched the numbers change. Each movement translated into clean data lines. That meant the system was not just recording. It was monitoring actively. Across multiple points. I looked toward the window again, but this time not at the trees. Beyond them. Somewhere in that direction, another lock was being touched. Another door being tested. I checked the time stamp. Current. Not delayed. Not stored. Live. That meant whoever controlled this system could see the same thing I was seeing. At the same time. That realization settled in slow and cold. I lowered the receiver slightly and listened. The cabin stayed quiet. No movement outside. No sound at the door. But the system was active somewhere else. I raised the device again and looked closer at the active node. A new line appeared. External authorization request pending. I did not touch anything. I just watched. The request stayed there. Waiting. Not forcing. Just waiting for input. My input. I had not programmed that. Not even close. I swallowed once, slow. If I accepted, I would be opening something. Not here. Somewhere else. I shifted my weight and glanced at the door again. The lock sat still. No light. No sound. But now I knew it was connected to everything on that screen. I looked back at the request. Still waiting. The system had paused for me. Like it expected a decision. My thumb hovered just above the screen. Not touching. Not yet. Because once I responded, I would not just be watching anymore. My thumb hovered over the screen, just a fraction of an inch away. The request did not blink. It did not push. It just waited. That was the part that felt wrong. Systems do not wait unless they are designed to be answered. I exhaled slowly and lowered my hand for a second. Think. Not react. That had kept me ahead so far. I looked back at the map again. My cabin pulsed steady. Normal. The other node, the one half a mile out, flickered with activity. Small changes. Subtle pressure shifts. Someone was still there. Still interacting with their lock. And the system had paused everything for me. That meant I was not just a user. I was part of the decision chain now. I raised the receiver again and studied the request more closely. External authorization request pending. No location tag. No identity. Just a channel waiting to be opened. I scrolled slightly, searching for more detail. Nothing. Clean interface. Minimal information. Designed that way on purpose. The less you know, the easier it is to say yes. I let out a slow breath and glanced toward the door again. The lock had not moved since earlier. No light. No sound. But I knew it was active. Connected to the same system in my hand. I stepped closer to it, just enough to hear the faint internal hum if I focused. It was there. Low. Consistent. Alive in a way it had never been before. I turned back to the receiver. The request still waited. Time stamp ticking forward. Each second recorded. This was being logged somewhere. Every hesitation. Every delay. That meant whoever built this expected hesitation. Expected resistance. Which meant they had seen it before. I tightened my grip on the device slightly. If I declined, the system would log that too. If I ignored it, same result. But if I accepted, I would not just be watching anymore. I would be opening a path inside their network. That thought settled in slow. I looked at the active node again. The data stream flickered. A new line appeared beneath the request. Secondary input detected. My chest tightened just enough to notice. That meant someone else was interacting with the same request. Not just me. I was not the only one seeing this. I was part of a shared control point. I leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowing. The secondary input line updated again. Response attempt initiated. Not completed. Someone out there had tried to answer this before. Me. Maybe the person at that other cabin. Maybe someone else entirely. But the system had not accepted it. It was still waiting. For me. I swallowed once, slow, and shifted my stance. The wood floor creaked softly under my boots. The cabin felt too quiet again. Like it was listening. I brought my thumb back over the screen. Closer this time. Close enough to feel the faint heat from the display. The request did not change. Still waiting. Still neutral. I hesitated for one more second. Then I noticed something small in the corner of the interface. A tag I had not seen before. Controller assigned. I froze. That was not there a moment ago. I did not assign anything. I did not authorize anything. Yet the system had already made a decision. I lifted my eyes slowly from the screen to the door. The lock gave a soft internal click. Not triggered by touch. Not triggered by pressure. Just a quiet shift. Like it had received an answer.